On May 4, 1970, the Kent State Massacre demonstrated how student protests against the Vietnam War created a national reaction and a revolutionary shift on the public's perspective of government power related to the war, while revealing the importance of youth activism in America. The National Guard's killing of four unarmed students sparked mass protest, increased distrust in government, and transformed views on state power in the Vietnam War. In 1954, Vietnam was divided into Communist North Vietnam and Capitalist South Vietnam. The United States committed itself to defending the South and containing the spread of communism. Initially, the United States, during the presidencies of JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon, began giving economic resources to the South, but then eventually sent military and became directly involved. By the late 1960s, more than 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam, and it was still unclear if the North or South would win. Uncertainty among citizens at home intensified anger and fear in the United States, particularly among college students who faced the risk of potentially being sent to fight in Vietnam. Anti-war movements continued throughout the late 60s, but on April 30th, 1970, President Nixon, whose initial campaign promised to end the war, announced that the U.S. would invade Cambodia, as he believed it would support Vietnamization and ultimately strengthen South Vietnam while protecting U.S. troops. This announcement led to anger nationwide, causing protests all across the country, but tensions reached an extreme on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio. Less than 24 hours after Nixon's speech, Kent students gathered to protest the expansion of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Hundreds of students came together on campus, chanting anti-war slogans and expressing their anger towards the government. In the following days, protests continued and tensions escalated further. Due to the chaos, Ohio Governor James Rhodes deployed the National Guard to campus, stating that the protests posed a threat to the public. That same evening, the campus ROTC building was set on fire. By May 3rd, Kent State was completely under control by the National Guard as guards patrolled the campus and enforced curfews. Later that day, Governor Rhodes arrived on campus and delivered a speech condemning the protesters, calling them enemies of the state, as well as establishing a sentiment of martial law. This speech further escalated tensions on campus and fueled students' anger toward the state and federal governments. On May 4th, around noon, hundreds of students gathered on the Kent State Commons for another protest. Only 10 minutes after the protest started, the National Guard told students that the protest was unlawful and that they needed to disperse. When students refused to leave, guardsmen fired tear gas and moved toward the protesters. Strong winds blew the tear gas away from the students, which limited its effects. Because of this, the guardsmen began to back up and marched up Blanket Hill, away from the Commons. Students felt empowered by the guards' retreat and began to follow them up Blanket Hill. Once the guards reached the top of the hill, they briefly paused with their backs turned to the students. Then, at 12:24 p.m., several threatened guardsmen turned back towards the students and began to open a fire in a chaotic manner prompted by miscommunication. In 13 seconds, 67 shots were fired. Students ran, screamed, and fell to the ground in confusion. The shooting resulted in the deaths of Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schuer, and William Schroeder, as well as 9 other students being wounded. The shooting created a national reaction. Kent State was in the national eye, and federal officials, the state of Ohio, and anti-war organizations strongly demanded for an investigation. Many debates surrounding the violence in Vietnam also began, as people started to see the horrors and division around the war beginning at home as well. By May 8th, the federal government stepped in with the arrival of the FBI on campus. In 2 weeks, the FBI had over 7,500 pages of reports and concluded that the shooting was unjustified. In July of 1970, after reviewing the FBI's evidence and other reports, the U.S. Justice Department determined that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute any of the guardsmen involved in the shooting. The victims and their families didn't agree with the decision not to charge the guardsmen, and in 1971 and 1972 filed 14 separate civil lawsuits against the Ohio National Guard, the state of Ohio, and Governor Rhodes. On March 29, 1974, 8 guardsmen were indicted on criminal charges directly related to the shooting. The introduction of this trial led to the 14 civil lawsuits being put on pause. The case aimed to debate whether or not the guardsmen's shots were justified or simply used to deprive students of their constitutional right to protest. The trial collected 33 witness accounts describing the events that transpired on May 4th and their personal injuries and trauma caused by it. But shockingly, before the defense even presented its case, Judge Battisti acquitted all 8 guardsmen. Battisti ruled that the government had failed to prove that the defendants acted with criminal intent, and as a result, the criminal trial ended. By 1975, all 14 original lawsuits filed by victims and their families were consolidated into one trial, Krause v. Rhodes. The families of the deceased and wounded all tried together against Governor Rhodes, Kent State President Robert White, and generals of the Ohio National Guard. The victims' lawyers argued that the state officials and National Guard leaders needed to be held responsible for ordering or failing to prevent the shootings, and that victims were prohibited to express their constitutional rights to protest. Defendants argued that the National Guard acted in self-defense, and Governor Rhodes argued that him and National Guard generals were not responsible for the guardsmen's actions. On August 27, 1975, the jury concluded that the state officials and National Guard leaders were not personally responsible for the actions of the guardsmen on May 4th. But in 1977, the Krause v. Rhodes verdict was overturned due to a juror receiving outside threats which altered jury voting results. In 1978, a complete retrial began, but before a verdict was reached, the parties reached a settlement in January of 1979 for $675,000 divided among the 13 plaintiffs, and the state of Ohio issued a formal statement of regret for the events that took place on May 4, 1970. This settlement represented a meaningful reform, as it showed recognition from the state that they were unsuccessful in protecting the rights and safety of the students. In the years following the shootings, student protests didn't simmer down, they intensified. Student demonstrations continued throughout the 70s. These protests not only focused on the Vietnam War, but also the fear and distrust of government authority. Nixon reacted to the public with calm and order-focused language on the outside, but in private he expressed deep resentment of the growing movement and ultimately viewed the movement as a threat. In 1972, Nixon was re-elected in a landslide and reacted to the unrest on campuses by calling on the silent majority of the U.S. to stand up to the war protesters. Across the nation, the student activism strengthened in universities and in protest organizations. Students still demanded more thorough rules regarding freedom of speech and limits on the use of government force during protests. The anger of Kent State transformed protests into a core part of political involvement on college campuses throughout the nation. The nation also found ways to express themselves through music. Artists ranged from names as big as Neil Young to names as local as Devo, a band formed by Kent State students. Devo's music reflected a sense of regression in societal norms, viewed by band members as the driving forces to the shooting as a whole. Music made about Kent State was raw and emotional, which captured the outrage people felt and helped demand American accountability. On March 29, 1973, the U.S. officially left Vietnam, marking the end of the Vietnam War. Although the Kent State shooting didn't directly cause the U.S. to end their involvement in the war, the shooting put pressure on the government to end it. After the shootings, universities became much more careful about police and government involvement during protests. Certain states and campuses began to implement limits on how and when National Guard could be called. The events that took place on May 4, 1970 sparked a revolution that encouraged greater youth involvement in politics and marked a turning point in student activism as a result of corruption or injustice. Students expressed their anger not only through protests but music, poetry, and art, which challenged authority and demonstrated extreme opposition to the Vietnam War. The May 4th tragedy also prompted reforms such as the ratification of the 26th Amendment and the War Powers Resolution, both which aimed to protect freedom of speech and encourage people to state their political opinions. Ultimately, Kent State revealed the power of youth activism by creating the largest student strike in U.S. history, transforming views on state authority and the nation's approach to dissent.